in his lyrics, in which he frees himself from the hitherto exclusively dominant Petrarchian type, and is, in a truly original manner, both novel and sublime. In boldness of imaginative power, in lofty flights of genius, in freedom and diversity of form, he has had no equal in his native land until the 19th century. But he had no imitators in his own age. The fashion favoured Marini. The style of elegant prose literature was equally affected by the depraved taste of the times. It would indeed be difficult to name here a single original book of permanent value. Letters, however, on the most varied political, social and intellectual questions were then much in favour, and the collections of those of Cardinal Bentivoglio, a distinguished statesman and historian, and of the renowned Galileo are worthy of mention. Boccalini's satire Miscellanies from Parnassus is a racy booklet that in its day enjoyed great popularity. Highly characteristic of the humane but effeminate Italian of his epoch is his outburst against the military spirit and the usages of war. War, he says, is sometimes necessary, but it is yet a condition so inhuman and barbarous that there are no fine words that can make it tolerable. Boccalini was an enthusiastic Republican and therefore loathed Venice, while he scourges with bitter irony the petty princely tyrants of his time. In his Touchstone he develops his political sentiments still more trenchantly, and in doing so sheds a clear light on contemporaneous public opinion in Italy. He gives undisguised and wrathful expression to the hatred of all Italians for Spanish domination, for the court of the Catholic king, and for his subjects' arrogant lust for conquest and ascendancy. The Italy of our epoch boasts of two admirable historical works, Bentivoglio's History of the War in the Netherlands and Davila's Civil War in France. Both writers show the same sobriety of judgment and appropriate style and method that distinguished the great Italian historians of the 16th century. Both were intimately acquainted with the lands of which they wrote. Bentivoglio had resided as papal nuncio in Brussels and Paris. Davila had held important military and political posts in France and Venice. Passing from practical to theoretical politicians, we come to the name of Thomas Campanella. This philosophical Dominican monk, persecuted both by the Spanish government and the Inquisition, wrote a treatise on the State, which, along with much eulogy of the Papal and French courts, contains many sound observations. His City of the Sun is a fantastic sort of political and social utopia, based in many parts on the Platonic model, but permeated with his own chimerical and mystical philosophy. Hunted incessantly by his numerous foes, this gifted monk died in 1639 in the retirement of the monastery. Much more practical than Campanella was Antonio Serra, whose work on the causes of wealth in gold and silver is a work of political economy of high value for the history of this science. It comprises a complete exposition of the so-called mercantile system, which later, through Colbert's example, prevailed throughout Europe for more than a century. This system lays the main stress on manufactures and commerce, which it holds to be much more susceptible of development than agriculture, and which therefore ought to be fostered at the expense of the latter. Serra's book, 1613, had great influence on the economical and financial opinions of the day. His ideal was the state of Venice, wealthy because it was an exclusively commercial city, as contrasted with poor agricultural Naples. In the exact sciences, Italy contended for the foremost place with Germany, which could boast of her Copernicus and Kepler. Cavalieri, professor of mathematics in Bologna, carried the mathematical ideas suggested by the latter great scholar still farther, and through his work on the Geometry of the Indivisibles, 1635, became the father of modern geometry. By this method he attained much more precise determinations and measurements than had been possible before. Aldrovandi summed up the whole zoological knowledge of his time in comprehensive handbooks. Caspar Aselli, professor of anatomy in Pavia, discovered the lacteals of the mesentery that convey the chyle to the blood, and thus play an important part in the alimentation of the animal body. But the most eminent, most gifted, and most renowned figure in Italian science was Galileo Galilei. Born at Pisa in 1564, the son of an able mathematician, he studied medicine in his native city, but soon turned to mathematical and physical studies, seeking for these a firm and reliable foundation in mathematics. A remarkable faculty of observation, an acute judgment, and an intellect at once profound and clear united to qualify him for making his amazing discoveries. The oscillations of a lamp suspended from the dome of the cathedral at Pisa led to the discovery of the equal duration of the oscillations of a pendulum, and with this he associated the most interesting investigations concerning the centre of gravity of bodies. One of the first fruits of his labours was the invention of the hydrostatic balance, by which he determined the specific gravity of bodies. His most important discoveries were made after he had exchanged the mathematical chair of Pisa for that of Padua. Here his contributions to science were the thermometer, a proportional compass or sector, and the refracting telescope for astronomical investigations (1609). Imperfect as was Galileo's telescope, chiefly from the limited extent of its field, the great man was yet able to make the most astonishing observations with it. He recognised the inequalities on the moon's surface, and rightly attributed these to mountains. He even made approximate calculations of their height. Further, he resolved the Milky Way and certain other nebulae into multitudes of suns, massed in special points of the firmament. He detected 4 little stars in the neighbourhood of Jupiter, and rightly determined them to be satellites of the great planet. These surprising discoveries he announced in a book which justly bore the title of Nuncius Siderus, the Starry Messenger. Men at this time took the liveliest interest in astronomy, partly because the theories and writings of Copernicus and Kepler had aroused their curiosity, but probably more because the science was so intimately associated with astrology. The Nuncius Siderus attracted universal attention, and the Grand Duke of Tuscany, by rewarding its author with the richly endowed sinecure of court mathematician, made it possible for Galileo to devote himself in Florence exclusively to his studies. His astronomical discoveries now followed in rapid succession, one of the principal being the Earth-like character of the planets, as opposed to the solar nature of the fixed stars. Galileo's telescopic observations had fully convinced him of the absolute correctness of the Copernican theory of the universe. His advocacy of this brought the wrath of the Church upon his head, for it had denounced the Copernican system as heretical. Galileo offered to prove that this system was in perfect harmony with orthodoxy, but this attempt to compel the Church to submission in her own domain only served to embitter her more. Through personal exertions in Rome, Galileo had no difficulty in securing his own safety, but he could not prevent the Index officers from stigmatizing Copernicus's doctrine as "absurd and infidel," and placing his book, with several of Galileo's own treatises relative thereto, in the Index Prohibitorum. The philosopher submitted to the ecclesiastical dictum, but in his heart he rebelled against the judgment. When, 7 years later, his friend and patron, Cardinal Barberini, ascended the papal throne as Urban VIII, he again ventured in a "Dialogue of the Two Chief Systems of the Universe, on a comprehensive demonstration of the truth of the Copernican views." Scarcely was the work published (1632) when the Jesuits persuaded the Pope that the astronomer had held him up to ridicule. Galileo had to appear before the Inquisition in 1633. In spite of the contemporaneous and subsequent falsifications in the records of the process, it is now proved that Galileo was really subjected to torture in accordance with the terms of sentence pronounced on him. The permission to print, formerly granted to him, was declared to have been obtained under false pretences, and the philosopher, then in his 70th year, was compelled on bended knee to abjure the Copernican doctrine. His dialogue was suppressed, and he himself was condemned to imprisonment for an indefinite time. His sentence was indeed commuted to enforced retirement at his own villa at Florence, and he never again regained full liberty. A victim to manifold bodily sufferings, He survived his trial 8 years, and died in 1642. He had become blind, yet had occupied himself unremittingly with scientific work, and with the compilation and arrangement of the results of his earlier investigations. In Italy these could not be published, but this was accomplished abroad, especially in Germany. Like Italian poetry, architecture fell into decay. True beauty, nobility of form, and symmetry of proportions were sacrificed to violent and tasteless effects. The aim now was massiveness in proportions, extravagant richness of ornamentation, and pictorial perspective not at all in harmony with the essential nature of this art. Nothing kept its natural character, the straight lines of the walls were converted into advancing and retiring curves with bulky projections. Architraves were sinuous, the gables of open work without purpose, the pillars unreasonably serpentine. Everywhere there was an ostentatious profusion of interlaced foliage, fruit pieces, figures, shells, and emblems of all kinds. Lorenzo Bernini, 1598 to 1680, is the most prominent representative of this Baroque style. His disciple and rival, Francesco Borromini, sought to surpass him through the exaggeration of tasteless ornamentation and the preposterous medley of all the constructive elements. His example was unfortunately too much followed north of the Alps. In the art of sculpture also Bernini was the despot of his age, and here too all canons of art and good taste were outraged. Extravagant emotions, sensual treatment of the nude, coarse strength in the male figures, coquettish attitudes in those of the females, were too much in keeping with the effeminate life of the Italy of his period. A host of subordinate masters imitated his vicious example. Neither could Italian painting remain entirely unaffected by the prevailing tendency. But here this was by no means so incongruous as in the case of sculpture. There were at this period highly gifted artists who knew how to elevate it from its eccentricities and how to purify and ennoble it. In the beginning of our epoch, the Carracci sought to bring painting back to the study of nature and of the great artists of the 16th century, and they attained the happiest results. But their disciples, Domenico Zampieri, commonly called Domenichino, and Guido Reni, were able to follow this tendency only in their earlier pictures, and soon began to prefer showy ornamentation and the somewhat excessive sweetness of expression. Carlo Dolci is the characteristic representative of this school, yet these artists, among whom Francesco Barbieri, called Guercino, takes a high prize, knew how to lend a high and enduring value to their works, and to elevate them above the commonplace of mere sensuous effects, by the marvellous blending and power of their colours, by their sense for the beautiful, and by their truth of feeling. In politics, Italy and Spain retired more and more into the background to make room for the predominating influence of France. A great revolution too was preparing in the east of Europe, which was to elevate Russia at the expense of Poland and Turkey. On the destiny of Poland, the 25 years' reign of the fanatical disciple of Jesuitism, Sigismund III, exercised the most baneful influence. In this time all the germs of corruption were developed, which the predominance of a selfish petty nobility and the brutal violence of the counter-reformation had introduced into the State. For a time, indeed, the valour of her nobles and her abundant population maintained the prestige of Poland abroad. Her intervention in Russian affairs gained for her, at the Peace of Devulino (1618), Smolensk, Severa, and Chernigov, important provinces which introduced her sway into the very heart of Russia. But this success was much more than counterbalanced by the rise of a powerful and popular dynasty in Russia, endowed with all the freshness and vigour of youth. The decline of the welfare of the Polish people became more and more rapid. Wild revolts of the refractory nobles shook the fabric of the State. The great rebellion of the Voivode Nicolas Zebrzydowski, notwithstanding occasional successes of the royal troops, was brought to an end only by inglorious concessions on the part of the Crown. A war with Turkey, provoked by a contest over the election of a prince in Moldavia, ended with the Peace of Chotin in 1621, which conceded to the Turks this fortress, commanding the most important passage of the Dniester, as well as the sole right of nominating the Moldavian princes. Scarcely was this war closed when Sigismund involved himself in the great German religious war by taking the side of Catholicism and Austria. This act he expiated by the cession to Gustavus Adolphus of a part of Prussia and of Livonia. After Sigismund's death, although no rival appeared to contest the crown with his son Władysław, it pleased the nobility to institute an interregnum for 6 months, during which the turbulent elements were free to indulge unchecked in violence, plundering and personal feuds. Finally Władysław IV was elected, a man by no means wanting in courage and military ability. When the Russian Tsar, Michael Romanov, attempted to take advantage of the change in Polish rulers to recover the provinces which he had lost by the Peace of Dębulino, Władysław completely hemmed in his army and forced it to capitulate. The peace concluded at Jasna confirmed Poland in her possession. Furthermore, the Peace of Stumsdorf with Sweden, 1635, gave back to the king, if not Livonia, at least that portion of Prussia lost by his father. But the process of internal decay had made rapid strides from 2 causes: the predominance of the clergy and the growing usurpation of the nobility. Władysław was an obedient disciple of the Church. The Jesuits had already higher education in their hands. The king made over to them the middle and lower schools as well. Henceforth, in Poland, teaching had to be in strictest accordance with the dicta of the Church. The nobles, on their part, broke down the military strength of the kingdom through a law that the standing army should consist only of a guard of 1,200 men, the object being to make the ruler wholly subservient to them. The punishment for this selfish and unwise procedure of the nobles was not long in coming. We have already spoken of the constitution of the Cossack state proper, on the middle and lower Dnieper, which developed by Russian and Lithuanian fugitives, had received from King Stephen Batory a firm organization under Polish suzerainty, yet resting on entirely independent military institutions. It soon acquired considerable power, and its undaunted warriors, not content with combating the Turks and Crim Tartars by land, took with equal skill and courage to the sea, and in their light boats plundered without cessation the shores of Asia Minor and the Balkan Peninsula, spreading terror into the very harbour of Constantinople. The Porte had often complained at Warsaw. This gave the Poles a pretext for attempting to exterminate not only the political freedom, but also the Greek religion of the Cossacks. First, these were compelled to renounce the election of their hetman, and to submit to the leadership of the Polish commander-in-chief. Then the Jesuits came into the land and shut up their churches, permitting only the worship of the so-called Greek Unionists, who acknowledged the authority of Rome. Ultimately, Polish nobles settled in the Ukraine and transformed the hitherto free Cossacks into serfs. As these repeatedly rose in revolt, the Poles, in their Diet of 1638, took advantage of their rebellion to take from them all personal and political rights. The Cossacks found a leader in Bogdan Khmelnytsky, whom a Polish noble had deprived of his land. As Khmelnytsky could obtain no justice in Warsaw, he raised the banner of revolt in 1648. Forthwith, the whole Ukraine was under arms. The people of Little Russia, embittered by the Jesuits' zeal for conversion, streamed into the camp of the new hetman. Even their former foes, the Tartars, greedy for Polish spoil, sent help. In the midst of these disorders, King Władysław IV died in 1648. The nobles wrangled for 5 weeks over the election of a king, to Zamość with destruction in his train. At length the exertions and the gold of the Queen Widow secured the election of John Casimir, brother of the deceased. The last of the house of Vasa, he had been, up to this time, a Jesuit and a cardinal, but the Pope freely released him from the priestly order. He proved, however, by no means equal to the situation. He first sought to win over Khmelnytsky, but the Polish nobles would hear nothing of dealings with the despised "peasants," and under the leadership of Jeremiah Wiśniowiecki, fell suddenly on the unsuspecting Cossacks, massacring them mercilessly. This scandalous outrage fired the Cossacks with the wildest passion for revenge. Bogdan, in alliance with the Tartar Khan, Islam Gerai, vanquished the king and his array of nobles in various battles on the plain of Zborov, and so hemmed him in that he was forced to come to terms with the Cossacks. He had to grant to them their former practical independence, and to pay a yearly tribute to the Tartars. The Greco-Catholic metropolis of Kiev received a seat and a vote in the Polish Senate. From these experiences the Polish aristocracy might have drawn the conclusion that the welfare of their fatherland demanded a more centralized government, but in the Diet of 1652 the infamous Liberum Veto was declared a perpetual law. There had never really been any systematic voting in the Diet. The majority had been in the habit of simply shouting down the minority, or if the latter did not acquiesce gracefully, of compelling them to submission by violence, and occasionally by murder. On one occasion, when the most important measures in regard to the defence of the kingdom against the Cossacks and Tartars were under consideration, one insignificant Lithuanian country member shouted into the hall, "I dissent," and forthwith fled that he might not be compelled to change his vote. His friends and party maintained that, except by unanimous consent, the Diet could arrive at no valid decision, and this view, absurd as it is, they were able to enforce. The Diet still separated without result. Thenceforth, any member had the power to nullify the proceedings of the Diet by the use of the Liberum Veto. Never has the passion for personal liberty carried a ruling class to so pernicious an extreme. To the caprice of the individual were sacrificed the peace, the greatness, nay, the very existence of the fatherland. While the nobles in this way doomed the kingdom to weakness and internal dissolution, they revoked the compact entered into with the Cossacks. Above all, the Jesuit party in the Senate would hear nothing of the admission of the schismatic metropolis, Kiev, into the Diet. Provoked by the constant insults and encroachments of the Poles, Bogdan Khmelnytsky once more took up arms. The Cossacks soon found a mightier ally than the Tartars. In 1654 they finally renounced Polish rule and placed themselves under the protection of their co-religionists, the Russians. The Tsar, Alexis Mikhailovich, gladly agreed to all their conditions. They were to be ruled by their own elected chiefs in accordance with their own laws, and were to pay no tribute. 60,000 of them were to be enrolled for war service and receive regular pay from the Tsar. Henceforth, this martial people, instead of being a bulwark of Poland against Russia, became the frontier guard of Russia against Poland. With overpowering strength, in which religious zeal played no small part, the Russians and Cossacks repelled the attacks of the Poles, conquered White Russia and Lithuania, and even took the fortress of Lublin in Poland proper. With the political decline of Poland was associated her intellectual decadence. The preceding epoch of the Reformation is regarded as the golden age of Polish literature. Nicolas Rey (1507 1568) celebrated sometimes the views of the reformers, sometimes the joys of love, and gave his robust humour expression in strongly spiced satires. Of much higher and finer endowments than this gifted country gentleman was John Kochanowski (1530 1584), the foremost of Poland's older poets. In him profound knowledge of classical antiquity was associated with deep political feeling and the happiest mastery of expression. As a lyric poet he was never equalled in Poland. Side by side with these noble authors stand the low-born Sebastian Klonowicz. His revolutionary temper found voice in powerful and racy but bitter verses. Prose was written almost exclusively in Latin. All the more credit therefore belongs to Lucas Górnicki's Courtier, which was written in Polish, and is an admirable mirror of the usages of the higher society of his time. The exciting political and religious life of the period exerted a stimulating influence on Polish oratory, of which some masterpieces remain. Under the direful rule of Sigismund III, the lustre of Polish literature began to grow dim. The burghers were shut out not only from all participation in public life, but also from the higher education. Even the nobles ceased to resort to foreign universities, so perilous, as they believed, for their faith. The University of Cracow rapidly retrograded. The authority of a tutelary and exclusive church interdicted all free investigation and independent thought. The political disorganization and the self-seeking of the ruling caste enfeebled every higher national aspiration. Soon Latin became the dominant literary language. Little except translations from the French appeared in the native tongue. After long continued disorder, Russia had received a firm organization through the installation of the new dynasty of the House of Romanov. The Tsar, Michael Fedorovich, was a well-meaning but weak prince, who all his life was subservient to foreign influences. The boyars availed themselves of this weakness to exert a considerable influence on the government, but the situation was changed when, after the Peace of Devolino, the Tsar's father, the monk Filaretus, returned from a Polish prison and was nominated by his son to the Patriarchate of Moscow. This energetic man became joint ruler and caused